topics mostly related to history and current affairs. He's written a book on the pre-World War era known as FDR's Republicans. That was published in 2010. He's a professor of history. He's taught courses at the college level for a number of years. He's also done research for documentary films and worked as a producer and writer for television. And I just learned that he, going way, way back to one of our early modernism shows at the Omni Showroom Hotel, it must go back at least 30 years. He was actually provided some video footage of that show. So he has a much longer history with Art Deco than I realized. He has a BA from American University, a master's degree from the University of Chicago, and a PhD from the University of Maryland, and calls Maryland home currently. The program you're going to enjoy this evening, we first learned about it, some of us first learned about it at the World Congress on Art Deco that happens every 2 years. It happened this past spring in Cleveland, and Dr. Jenner gave his talk then. And it was just a lot of fun. A lot of us just had this really wonderful, warm feeling at the end of it. And it's obviously focused on the work of, and a little bit on the life of Irving Berlin. And he basically talks and sings his way through the history of Irving Berlin. It's a lot of fun. And when I showed up to the program, I learned that there was a sing-along component, which I absolutely dreaded. Like some of you, the summation of my musical career was lip-syncing to hymns at church service on Sunday mornings. And, but I actually sung during the program, so there's really an element of magic to this. I think you're going to have a lot of fun with it. So with that, would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Irving Jenner.
Well, good evening. I guess you're prepared now to know we're going to do some singing tonight. But the main impetus of this program is to talk about Irving Berlin and make the case that he represents, as I call him, the maestro of the Art Deco era. And so what we're looking at here tonight is how his life and his music and his times are all represented in his work. So let's hope I can convince you. At that Art Deco Congress Steve mentioned, I had a lady who really wanted to argue with me about how she thought Cole Porter was the better choice. So I'm open to the debate as we go along. Well, for starters, did you know that Irving Berlin wrote over 3,000 songs in his lifetime? How about that? Yet he never learned to play the piano properly, only using the black keys. He only played in the key of F sharp. Later, he actually relied on a special piano with a lever that could convert the key of the piano for him. Kind of interesting. Nonetheless, with such a poor musical education, he still produced 20 Broadway shows and 17 Hollywood musicals. So that speaks highly of that. But does this justify my assertion that he is the maestro of the Art Deco era? Well, let's start at the beginning. His first famous memory is seeing the family home burned by Cossacks in Russia. He was only 4 years old. His family of 10 migrated to New York City in 1892. The family lived in a 3-room apartment with no windows. Can you imagine? No windows in their apartment. His father, Moses Balin, was unemployed, a cantor, who brought little Israel, that is Irving's real name, Israel, known as Izzy by his family, Balin, to choir practice. But I think the international mix of the Lower East Side, Chinese, Italian, and Polish, may have had more, or at least a greater impact on his musical taste than just going to synagogue. His father died when he was 8, and around the age of 12, he announced to his mother that he wanted to be a singing waiter in the local saloon. She refused to allow such a thing of a son of a cantor, and Izzy left. He walked out at 12 to live on his own on the streets sang for coins on corners to make a go of it. He actually would wash his clothes in the water fountain and dry them off in the basement of an apartment building on the furnace. He'd live in the front hallway of an apartment building, so this was pretty rough. Eventually, he did realize his dream and got a job as a singing waiter in a Chinatown dive. There, as a waiter, he provided lyrics for the saloon's pianist, and one of the compositions they produced was published, and the publisher misspelled Irving Berlin's name. Instead of Balin, he spelled Berlin, and Irving changed his first name to be less ethnic, and that's how the name Irving Berlin was born. He fast-talked his way into a job as a lyricist at a music company, later working with a pianist, and he composed music as well. He then learned enough on the piano to pick out a tune, and he wrote his own songs. His breakout hit, Alexander's Ragtime Band, sold 1 million copies in less than 3 weeks. We're talking about printed music here. 1 million copies in less than 3 weeks. That's a pretty good hit. That was in 1911. He married Dorothy Getz in 1912, a non-Jewish girl, much to the consternation of his mother. Berlin's life was shattered when his true love died 5 months after their marriage. Tough times for Irving Berlin at that point. Now, there are many reasons I've chosen Irving Berlin as maestro of the Art Deco era, and that's what we're going to explore tonight. For starters, Berlin was incredibly productive. As I've said, 3,000 works to his name. Unlike his contemporaries, Jerome Kern, the father of the modern musical, and George Gershwin, Irving Berlin actually not only wrote the music, but he wrote the lyrics. That's actually somewhat uncommon. Not only that, he had a knack for writing songs that matched the performer. Some of those stars that benefited were Al Jolson, Vernon, and Irene Castle, and later Eddie Cantor actually attributed much of their success to Irving Berlin. But more importantly, his music and his life seem to embody and reflect the Art Deco era. As the era emerged in 1925, Irving Berlin was becoming shall we say, involved with a wealthy Long Island socialite named Ellen Mackey. Ellen Mackey's grandfather had owned the Comstock silver gold mine. Yikes. Her father had laid the transatlantic cable. So I guess it's not a terrible surprise that her father disapproved of this relationship, so they kept it a secret. And that's not easy to do in the golden age of newspapers. We're talking the 1920s, of course. And you know, newspapers were a huge part of our life, really an expression of our culture of the 20s and 30s. And the song we're going to sing first is an expression of the frustration that Irving Berlin had having to keep his relationship with Ellen Mackey a secret. He denied it to the press, but of course, to no avail. They were all over this, trying to find out what's going on here. So are you ready to sing this famous song, which is still pretty good today, from 1925, What'll I Do? And I think now that you know the setting, you'll understand what the lyrics are all about. So on the count of 3, are you ready to give it a go? All right. 1, 2, 3. What'll I do when you are far away and I am blue? What'll I do? What'll I do when I am wondering who is kissing you? What'll I do? What'll I do with just a photograph to tell my troubles to? When I'm alone with only dreams of you that won't come true, what'll I do? That sounds pretty good today, actually. Well, eventually Ellen broke with her father, even under threat of being disinherited, and married Berlin In revenge, by the way, she left the space for her father's name blank on the marriage certificate. How about that? Now the marriage was accompanied by a honeymoon to Europe, upon which they took a cruise, and they were followed by 100 journalists. So that gives you an impression of the importance and the impact of journalists. Also, if you see some of those old movies about heiresses who run out on their fathers and their families, like It Happened One Night, that was actually inspired by the Berlin-Mackey romance. So you see a lot of those in the 30s, these heiresses who run off from their families. Now, in a world of the 1920s, of Dada and Cubism, the influence of the press can be seen in many of these artworks. You'll see newspaper cuttings in the works of Picasso and Juan Gris. But for Art Deco, newspapers were more important not as a subject, but as a means of conveyance of the new art form. Deco was a commercial form. Newspapers exhibited the new Art Deco styles and the designs in consumer products. So that's why newspapers are important to this era. Berlin was a very commercial person. He was very aware of social trends. He owned his own theater and produced his own shows. He recognized the importance of the automobile. Now, I think this is very insightful of him. Of course, we think of the 1920s as the emerging age of the automobile, and he noted that the automobile also affected music. No longer did those old horse and buggy rhythms resonate with the public. Like the automobile, they wanted a faster pace. We also see that in the world of Art Deco, where speed was reflected in streamlining. So again, in music, people want this faster, streamlining sound. Now, there were new materials in the Art Deco era as well. As you're probably familiar, aluminum made its appearance in the 20s. And of course, manufacturing meant repetitive motifs. Berlin was also concerned with the impact of radio. Radio starting to hit the airwaves in the late 20s. He's worried about how it's going to affect the publishing industry, which in fact it did. It pretty much killed printed music. But more importantly, the streetwise Berlin foresaw the need to organize songwriters, and he led a campaign to make sure Congress legislated laws that gave royalties to composers when their music was played on the radio. So this is no dumb person, and he's living in this period of increased industrialization, commercialization, and of course communication. Now, Art Deco was also a youthful style. I think we would all agree that it reflected the rebellion, the sort of revolutionary sort of lifestyle of the 1920s. And here again, Berlin lived that lifestyle. I mean, it's quite a lifestyle. I don't know how he got through it. He woke up late in the morning. He went to the theater. Then all afternoon, he gambled for high stakes. Yeah, he did. He went back to the theater. He must have eaten in there somewhere. Saw the evening's performance. Then he went home. He was an insomniac, and he composed his songs all night long. How could you keep that up? But talk about the frenetic pace of the 1920s. He's actually living it. He was also deeply and youthfully in love with Ellen Mackey. And the song Always, which we'll sing next, was actually his wedding present to his bride. What a cheapskate. He wrote her a song. Not necessarily. Over the course of the next 20 years, that song produced $500,000 for Ellen, who held the copyright. In today's money, it would be over $5 million. Not a bad wedding present. So shall we give this wedding present to his wife a whirl? Are you ready for Always? You still hear it today at weddings sometimes. 1926 on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. I'll be loving you always with a love that's true always. When the things you plan need a helping hand, I will understand always, always. Day not be fair, always. That's when I'll be there, always. Not just for an hour, not just for a day, not just for a year, but always. What a lovely sentiment, too. My goodness, that's just beautiful. Another element that distinguishes Art Deco from other art movements of its day is its use of color. When one views the Bakelite bracelets, the photos of the Chicago and the New York World's Fairs, and of course the array of colors from which you could choose your 1930s radio, it's incredible. I mean, the colors are incredible. Now, I admit, the next song is a bit of a stretch. Making the case that color and blue skies are somehow related may not be quite kosher, but Blue Skies was featured in the 1927 show Betsy. It was really an afterthought. The composers of the show asked Berlin to just throw in one more song. They needed one more song, and wouldn't you know, it was the hit of the show. So I thought we should actually give Blue Skies a spin. Ready on the count of three? 1, 2, 3. Blue skies smiling at me, nothing but blue skies do I see. Da-da-da. Blue birds singing a song, nothing but blue birds all day long. Never saw the sun shining so bright, never saw things going so right. Noticing the days hurrying by, when you're in love, my how they fly, those blue days, all of them gone, nothing but blue skies from now on. Now for Irving and Ellen, this period proved to be, well, anything but blue skies from now on. The tragedy that hit them, they did have 3 daughters, but their last child was a little boy who died in his first year on Christmas Day. Can you imagine? Which actually, I didn't have this in my notes, but it is interesting. A lot of people were really nasty about that. Berlin was Jewish, his wife Ellen was Catholic, and many people at the time said, oh, this is what you get when you mix marriage. Can you imagine? Berlin would have to fight depression at this time, and in many times he couldn't write at all. Of course, later we see the depression, the economic depression hit. That would add to his woes. But before the depression, in 1929, Berlin wrote "Putting on the Ritz." Now, we're not actually going to sing that song, but I think it's important to mention it because it is a monster hit. Just after. I'm glad you enjoyed that. But I want to mention that it was added to the Library of Congress this year of one of the greatest songs. They have a list of greatest songs, so it just entered that this year. Now, the song has an unusual rhythm. It's syncopated. Berlin was moving in new directions, and so was Art Deco. When you look at Art Deco from the 20s, it's rather symmetrical, but as you move into the 1930s, it starts to become asymmetrical. And when you listen to the rhythm of Berlin's song, Putting on the Ritz, you're going to see that he's also moving in a new direction. It's not that blue skies, regular rhythm at all. I'm not actually going to I'm just going to quickly give you the rhythm. Ba 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 da ba da ba 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 da ba 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 ba. Putting on the Ritz. So that's it's not blue skies anymore. This is a very irregular rhythm. So I think in many ways Berlin is changing as the Art Deco movement is moving into new directions. Okay, the crash wiped out Berlin financially. Absolutely invested badly and he was in big trouble. But he recovered in 1932 with his musical Thousands Cheer. He wrote about those tough times, and I've presented a song that represents that. Let's Have Another Cup of Coffee. Yeah. And that's about all you could afford at the Automat 1933. The Depression also bankrupted Ellen's father, her estranged father. And I think Berlin just went really beyond what was necessary. He really bailed his father-in-law out. And of course, that sort of patched up the rift between father and daughter. During these deep days of the Depression, several songs stand out as anthems of that era. Perhaps you remember Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? That's a well-known song from the 30s. And maybe for those movie lovers, Joan Blondell got a lot of fame in the early 30s when she sang The Forgotten Man in Gold Diggers of 1933. I forget the actual film. Now, these are considered Depression classics. But Berlin's Let's Have Another Cup of Coffee is also considered one of those songs that reflect the era. But unlike the former two, Berlin's song is cheerful. It's optimistic and hopeful, both in its music and its lyrics. And in the art world at this time, the stark photographs of Margaret Burke White and the paintings of Edward Hopper captured the reality of the Dark Depression. And that's where Berlin and Art Deco are different. The color, the vigor, the innovation seen in Art Deco conveyed a very different message. It was a message of hope, and that's also the message we hear in Let's Have Another Cup of Coffee. So let's see how it makes you feel. I think it really perks us up. So here we go with Let's Have Another Cup of Coffee, 1932. On the count of 3, 1, 2, 3. Just around the corner, there's a rainbow in the sky. So let's have another cup of coffee, and let's have another piece of pie. Trouble's just a bubble, and the clouds will soon roll by. So let's have another cup of coffee, and let's have another piece of pie. Why, I feel better already. It's really a very upbeat sort of song. Well, as sound arrived in Hollywood, Hollywood came a-knocking at Irving Berlin's door. And in 1931, he was asked to Hollywood to provide a whole new musical soundtrack for the film Top Hat. Now, with stars like Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, Irving Berlin and Art Deco invaded Hollywood. And I want to point out that Art Deco's best dancers were, of course, Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, and Berlin was Fred Astaire's best friend. Wow. I mean, it's very interesting that Irving Berlin never, ever showed his music to anybody before it was published, except Fred Astaire. He actually showed the songs in the works and wanted his feedback. So this is a pretty darn close relationship. These classic RKO films epitomize Deco in La La Land. Top Hat is a classic song, but I like Cheek to Cheek. And just for personal reasons, I thought we would do this little rendition of this classic also from that film. So are you ready to sing Cheek to Cheek? Mm-hmm. All right. Again, on the count of 3, 1, 2, 3. Heaven, I'm in heaven, and my heart beats so that I can hardly speak, and I seem to find the happiness I see when we're out together dancing cheek to cheek. I mean, I could sing this song on and on, but there is a time constraint here. Now, Berlin's move to Hollywood occurred simultaneous with Art Deco's move from New York City to warmer climates. During the 1930s, Art Deco was the really on the rise in Miami, Havana, Houston, Tulsa, and of course, Los Angeles. It took on a new and less urban and more tropical flair during this period. This is when Art Deco exhibits pastels and whimsy and a more flowing style and expanded the palette of urban colors to the whole spectrum rather than just silver and gray. Berlin wasn't happy in Tinseltown. He was a native New Yorker and a city boy. But in 1937's Follow the Fleet, Berlin may have revealed another reason for his discontent with Hollywood. The Jewish movie moguls of Hollywood avoided mentioning the rising power of Hitler in Germany. They believed it would appear self-serving and draw attention to their Jewishness. Berlin was also Jewish and an astute observer of society. His song, Let's Face the Music and Dance, carries a darker meaning today than it did in 1937. But as we sing this song, think of the days. It's 1937. The next year would be Kristallnacht. People were already being sent off to the camps. This song has a very eerie feel to it. And it is pessimistic, it's dark, it's in minor key. So as we sing this short passage from Let's Face the Music and Dance, think about that year, 1937. On the count of 3, 1, 2, 3. There may be troubles ahead, but while there's music and moonlight and love and romance, let's face the music and dance. Doesn't it take on a creepier feel after the fact? Anyway, he returned to New York in 1938. He gave God Bless America, a song he had written 17 years earlier, to Kate Smith to premiere on her radio show. It was a sensation. I mean, the phones were ringing off the hooks at NBC all night long. But did you know this? He gave the copyright and all of the proceeds of God Bless America to the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts. It was his way of thanking America for giving him the opportunities Russia never could have provided. He returned to Hollywood in 1941 to provide the songs for Holiday Inn and composed America's greatest selling Christmas recording, and that is I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas. That record has so far sold over 70 million copies and 30 million by Bing Crosby alone. Now, isn't that ironic? The most popular Christmas song was written by a Jewish composer. And let's not forget, he's also going to write Easter Parade, another Christian song. So it's kind of interesting in a way. You know, when he wrote I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas, he actually was dreaming of a white Christmas. He was in L.A. and he wanted to be back in New York. So isn't that interesting? There's a real sort of a reflection of his life. A new era was being born during the war. The international style was now sort of, have I got that right? Or would this be modern? I don't know. But we're moving on to a new era. No longer are we going to see the graceful, austere in Ginger Rogers movies. We're going to see people wearing zoot suits and wide lapels. Irving Berlin never liked swing music. He thought it's a passing fad. I don't like it. After the war, Berlin would go on to write his greatest musical in 1945, Annie, Get Your Gun. He would spend the 1950s translating his stage musicals into movies, and his family got him to retire in 1960 at the age of 72. And he couldn't stand it. He said, music is my hobby. I don't want to sit around the house and paint. I want to write songs. So he went back to work, but he never wrote another hit show. Annie, Get Your Gun was reprised on Broadway in 1966 with Ethel Merman in the starring role again, and it was again a smash hit. The year of his 80th birthday, he was feted at Carnegie Hall and with numerous television specials. He outlived his beloved Ellen and almost all of his friends, and finally passed away at the age of 101 in 1989.
Oh my God.
And you know, people on his birthday, New Yorkers sort of gathered under his apartment window. I mean, he was a number of stories up, and they sang his songs to him all night long. I mean, really sweet. You know, he claimed he was not a composer. Oh, composers write symphonies. He said, ever humble, I'm just a songwriter. But I think his old friend Jerome Kern summed it up best when asked, what did Irving Berlin mean to American music?